Grief is loud when people are around, and unspeakably quiet when they come home. On the third night after the funeral, the house sounded just like it did when I came home late in high school. Every footstep louder than necessary, every door reminding me that they too could slam if I asked them to. Instead, I went into the sewing room. It was a square little room at the back of the house, where the light was slanted and soft, as if the sun cared for her things too. Her singer sat under its cover like a sleeping animal. A tomato-shaped needlepoint pillow covered in needles waited nearby. Nothing had moved since the morning the ambulance had taken her away. The shoebox was behind a roll of fabric, the sky-blue cotton with the tiny white sprig I remembered from the dress she never finished. The box itself was ordinary, brown, crumpled in one corner, the lid held in place by twine that had been stuck in itself for so long that it had formed a permanent groove. I almost put it in the donation pile without looking. Then I thought of all the photos I had already found in places where photos didn't belong, in the freezer, in a flour mill, and pushed the lid back. The old letters smell like a version of time that is honestly telling of its end. I picked up the stack of letters tied with ribbon and saw her handwriting on the first envelope. Loop, careful, the same letters that signed every permit of my childhood. But the name on the front wasn't mine. It wasn't my father's. It wasn't a name I'd ever heard in this house. To no last name, just an initial and a comma, the beginning of a thought she didn't want anyone else to finish. My mother had no sister, no secret aunt to justify this closeness, no cousin I'd forgotten. My father had died 10 years ago, and over the years we'd learned to be silent. Hers, neatly folded, mine, turned inside out. But I didn't think I knew her composition the way children think they know the contents of the sky. Clouds, the sun, sometimes an airplane. Not that. I put the sheaf of letters on the table and placed my hands on either side of them, as if stabilizing a patient. In the back of the box were more letters, carefully stamped postcards, a photograph curled around the edges, a handkerchief wrapped around something hard. Coins, perhaps, a ring. Beneath it all, at the very bottom, was a single page folded in 4 until it was the size of a matchbox. On the outer fold, in faded pencil, was written, "Do not read." That should have been the end of it. People who loved her would have said, "Let the dead keep the privacy they carried so well." People who loved me would have said, "You don't need to know everything to grieve honestly." And yet, I had already started carrying the box before I realized how heavy it would be. I sat down. I untied the ribbon. The first letter began with a date that struck me. June 21st, 1975. I was 3 years old. My father was alive. The house I was sitting in had just been bought. The handwriting was my mother's, but it was looser, as if she had put down her polite pen and taken up the one that wrote the truth. Hey, today I saw someone who walked the way you do, shoulders forward, as if the world were both lighter and heavier when you carried it. I followed him for half a block to realize it wasn't you. I keep telling myself that a man can only walk in so many ways. There was nothing creepy about it, nothing dramatic, just that tense, painful honesty that she never used out loud. She wrote about the heat, about the price of bread, about a song on the radio that made the kitchen too cramped. And then, in a sentence that refused to be anything other than itself, I promised I wouldn't write. But I don't write it every day. I write it to you in my head, and the words fill the corners. I put the letter down and pressed my hands to my eyes until the stars appeared. The room didn't tilt. It behaved perfectly. But I didn't tilt. I pulled out another one. October 3rd, 1976. My father was starting to take extra change then. I remember the orange lunch pail and how I thought the sound of keys was music for grown-ups. When he laughs, it's a good sound. When he sleeps, it's a good piece. I'm not unhappy, and it's a confession I didn't expect to make. And yet you're here, like a song I can't turn off because it's plugged into an appliance without a plug. Who are you? I asked the empty room. Who were you to her? I told myself I would read one more and then stop. This is what people say when they've already chosen not to. February 9th, 1978. Snow that year. I remember a photograph of our yard under a white that made the shrubs look like they'd grown gentler. Hey, I dreamed you left a letter in the freezer between the peas and the ice cream, because that's where the important things go when you're overwhelmed by the heat. I woke up laughing and crying, which I do not advise, as it confuses the dog and frightens the child. The child was me. She wrote about me without naming me. Not secrets, just observations. The way I lined up my toy cars by color. The way I learned words fast and then hoarded them like candy. The way I asked for stories about when I was little even when I still was. And then, at the bottom of that page, smaller, you told me once that love is not a verdict, it's a landscape. I keep trying to live in the one I chose, but some days I find myself walking the roads of the one I didn't. I breathed like the room was thinner. The photograph under the stack was not labeled. Two figures on a pier, one almost certainly my mother, hair in a scarf, coat belted tight. The other a man with his back to the camera, hands in pockets, the body language of someone listening. The water behind them looked like a decision. I did not recognize the place. Or maybe I had never looked at my mother's life from far enough away to see that it included a horizon. The handkerchief yielded a coin after all, Canadian, 1969, and a subway token from a city we didn't live in. Talisman or proof, I couldn't tell. My mother had been many things, careful, devout, stubborn about recipes, but she was not sentimental with junk. If she kept it, it meant something. At last I held the tiny folded page with "Do not read" on the crease. It had the specific gravity of a dare and a blessing. My thumb hovered like it could learn restraint at this age. It didn't. I unfolded it slowly, as if paper could bruise. One line. 9 words. I kept my promise except for the boy. I sat very still. The house made a small settling sound, as if the walls had been listening and now needed to adjust. The boy. There are words that wake up every other word you know and make them rearrange themselves. Boy reached backward and forward at once. Kept raised 1,000 questions I wasn't ready to ask. Promise changed the temperature of the room. I placed the letter back in the shoebox, as gently as if it were sleeping. In the mirror above the sewing table, I saw a face that looked like mine and hers, and a little like the man on the pier if he had ever turned. Some choices you inherit without knowing. I closed the box, retied the ribbon the way she had, once, with hands that must have been shaking as little as mine were now. Then I slid the shoebox onto the table and did the strangest thing I could think of at that moment. I made tea. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard myself say, out loud and without ceremony, I have questions. Grief made room for curiosity the way night makes room for a new kind of quiet. Outside, the streetlight flickered, corrected itself, and held steady. When the tea cooled, I took the box to my room. I put it on the dresser I'd avoided, where my mother's mirror could see it and, by extension, see me. I promised the air nothing and everything. In the morning, I would decide whether to find A. For now, I turned off the lamp and let the darkness do what darkness does when it's honest. It doesn't hide the truth, it waits beside it. I didn't open the box the next morning. I didn't have to. It followed me, the idea of it, into the kitchen, into the yard, into the way I folded the newspaper even though no one else would read it. I cleaned out the fridge. I watered the garden. I refilled the bird bath. But all day, I thought about that line. I kept my promise except for the boy. I wanted it to mean something gentle. But gentle things don't get folded 4 times and marked "Do not read." That evening, I drove across town to Millie's salon, which hadn't changed its wallpaper since the Kennedy administration. My mother had gotten her hair set there every second Tuesday of her adult life. I figured if there were women in this world who knew things my mother never said, it would be the ones who shared curlers and quiet. Millie was still behind the counter, lacquered and unbothered. I told her I was cleaning out the house. She didn't blink. You're the type who'd do it slow. I nodded. I found some letters. That made her blink. Not mine, I added. Not my father's. She studied me the way older women do when deciding how much of their memory they're willing to lend. Were they recent? She asked. I shook my head. 70s mostly. A name I didn't recognize. Just an initial, A. Her expression softened. That's how it starts. What does? The unraveling. I almost turned and left. But then she sighed and said, she was human, sweetheart. Just like the rest of us. Millie didn't know who A was. Or claimed she didn't. She never said anything to me. But she did take a trip once, just before you turned 3. Said it was to visit a cousin in Ontario. She didn't have cousins in Ontario. Millie gave a small shrug. Exactly. I drove home through a storm that hadn't made up its mind. Just a mist. The kind that clings to windshields like hesitation. That night, I opened the box again. This time, I noticed the return addresses on some of the envelopes. Most were postmarked from New York. One, just one, from a place called Kingsville, Ontario. I pulled out that letter. It was dated July 1975. The paper had yellowed more than the others, like it had taken the brunt of the years. Hey, I dreamed we met at a train station. Not young, not old. Just two people waiting for different departures and pretending it was coincidence. I touched your arm. You touched my heart, but carefully this time. As if even in sleep, we'd learned the cost of too much hope. I Googled Kingsville the next morning. Population, small. History, long. There was a public library, a bakery, a tiny newspaper called the Kingsville Observer. It had no website, but it had a phone number. I called. A woman answered with the kind of voice that had never rushed in her life. I told her who I was. Told her I was trying to trace someone from the 70s. Gave her the initial and the date. She paused, then said, we don't keep obituaries that far back in print. But we have microfiche. If you're lucky, it's still legible. Would you mind checking? I asked. There was a rustle, a sigh, and the sound of old cabinets being opened, the sound of paper history waking up. 10 minutes later, she returned. We've got an Alexander Rowe listed. Passed away in 1980. Born 1940. Single. No spouse listed. No children. Do you have an address? She hesitated. There's a mention of a boarding house on Queen Street. No number. I thanked her, hung up, then stared at the box like it owed me an answer. Alexander. A. No children. No wife. But someone who wrote letters. Someone who was dreamed about on trains. I didn't know what I expected to feel. Anger? Sadness? What I felt was smaller than either, but somehow heavier. A kind of quiet envy. Not because of what she felt for him, but because she had once, in her life, chosen something just for herself. Later that week, I met with my mother's oldest friend, Margie Wells, who still wore her hair in rollers and believed tea should steep no less than 8 minutes, no matter how impatient your grief might be. She invited me in before I knocked. I heard you found something, she said. So much for privacy. She poured the tea, sat across from me, and said, you don't have to be mad at her. I'm not. You will be. Or you'll pretend you're not. It's the same thing. I said nothing. She added, she loved your father. I know. She also loved A. I looked up. Margie didn't flinch. We were young. She told me once, just once, and then never again. He was a window she looked through. But she chose the room she lived in. She kept writing to him. She had to. Why? To survive. On the way home, I stopped by the lake. My mother loved it there. We used to sit on the benches and count ducks. She used to say, still water makes me braver. I took the photograph from the box, the one on the pier, studied it, the scarf, the stance, the nearness, then flipped it over. One word, in her handwriting. Remember. I stood by the water a long time that day, long enough to see my own reflection and wonder if memory can be inherited. If it's possible to miss someone who might have been part of you, if your mother had made a different choice. And then I remembered the line again. I kept my promise except for the boy. And I finally understood. The boy was me. After I realized the boy in the letter was me, the house started feeling different. Not haunted, but paused. like the walls were waiting to see if I'd finally asked the right question. I didn't know what to do with the information. You carry grief one way. You carry mystery another. But this wasn't just mystery. It was inheritance, and I had no idea how to carry it yet. That weekend, I drove to Kingsville. I told no one. Just printed the map, packed a bag, and told the house. I'll be back. It didn't answer. The road was long and unremarkable. Fields blurred into trees, then back again. I stopped at a roadside diner shaped like a train car, drank coffee that had known better days, and practiced not rehearsing how I'd explain myself if someone asked what I was doing there. They didn't. Kingsville was the kind of town that looked like a memory the moment you entered it. The main street was 3 blocks long, and Queen Street ran quiet parallel to the water. I found the old boarding house easily. It was painted the color of forgotten pennies. No one answered the door. I walked the block twice, then found the Kingsville Library, a red brick building with wide steps and the smell of paper memory. The woman at the desk was not the one I'd spoken to on the phone, but she smiled like someone who had inherited patience. I'm trying to find out more about a man named Alexander Rowe, I said. He lived here in the 70s. Died in 1980. I believe he may have known my mother. She tilted her head. You look a little like him. I blinked. She said it casually, as if she'd said it before. I'm sorry, did you know him? No, she said. But we have photos. From the archive project. We digitized the town yearbooks, news clippings, and civic events. If he was here, we'll find him. It took her 5 minutes. She turned the screen toward me. There he was. 1976, volunteer fire department photo. Dark hair, gentle eyes, the same half-smile I had in every school picture my mother ever framed. He wasn't beautiful. He wasn't dramatic. He looked like a man you could trust with your quiet. I stared too long. Would you like a print? She asked. I nodded. She handed it over like a priest handing you communion. I carried it back to the car like it might break. Back in the motel room, I spread out the contents of the shoebox again. Read every letter. This time in order. I mapped the emotional timeline of a woman I thought I knew. Her loneliness, her restraint, her moments of slipping. And then one letter near the end, dated December 1979. Hey, the boy looks more like you every year. I don't tell him that, of course. I tell him he has his father's eyes. And maybe he does. But the tilt of his head when he's thinking, that's yours. I've stopped writing these letters to be answered. I write them so the truth doesn't drown. I hope, if you ever find them, you'll forgive me for making him my only exception. My hands shook, but my heart was quiet. That was when I realized. She hadn't written these letters to be read by him. She'd written them to be found by me. That night, I slept restlessly, dreamed of walking along a pier, a man waiting at the end, never turning. When I reached him, he was made of light, and when I spoke, my voice was my mother's. I woke with tears on the pillow. Not grief, not even sadness, just release. The next morning, I wrote my own letter. Not to her, not to him, to myself. It read, You are made of people who chose love even when it cost them. You are not broken for coming from an unfinished story. You are proof that something real happened, and you are allowed to ask questions, even if the answers come in pieces. I folded the paper, placed it in the shoebox with the rest, tied the ribbon again, not to hide it, but to preserve it. And for the first time in days, I didn't feel like I'd lost something. I felt like I'd been given something rare, a version of truth that made room for everyone in it, even me. When I got home, the house welcomed me with its usual silence. But it didn't feel quite the same. Not like a place holding its breath anymore. More like someone who had finally exhaled. I set the shoebox back on the dresser. Didn't open it. Didn't need to. I'd read every word. And more importantly, I'd felt what wasn't written. The next morning, I stood in my mother's bedroom and looked at her reflection one last time. Not in a mirror, but in the items that remained. A pressed handkerchief, a perfume bottle with just enough left to make you ache, a sewing kit she never let me touch as a child. I didn't feel betrayed anymore. I felt invited, like I'd been handed something delicate, not to break, not to judge, just to carry forward carefully. That weekend, I hosted a small dinner for my niece, Hannah. She's 16, full of questions she hasn't learned to ask yet, and has the same tilted head I now know came from Alexander Rowe. After dessert, she asked, "Uncle Mark, what were Grandma's dreams like? You know, before she was just someone's mother." I paused, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I suddenly knew exactly what to say. She loved to dance, I said. She loved writing things she didn't always send. And she loved in ways that didn't fit into the stories people were allowed to tell. Hannah leaned in, curious. "What do you mean?" She followed the rules. Mostly, except for one. Later that night, I left the shoebox on the kitchen table. Not hidden, not locked, just there. In case Hannah, or anyone, ever wondered what kind of woman my mother really was. And maybe one day, she'll open it, read the letters, feel the weight shift the way I did, and realize as I did, that some of the most beautiful parts of us are the ones we weren't meant to find, but were always meant to feel. A few weeks later, I stood by the lake again, the same one my mother loved. I brought no letters, no photograph, just a folded page of my own. I read it softly into the wind. You were not the story they told me. You were the one she never got to finish. And when I walked away, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I just closed the book, but finally knew the whole story.